Hello and welcome to No Confidence. I'm your host, David Myrland. None of this is legal advice. This is a recording of an August 2nd, 2017 interview. I appeared on Lowell Becraft's brand new show, Liberty's Hammer. Law for Patriots on toginet.com. And here's a tape of that call. Sounds like he's coming around to the argument about Chapter 1 of the Tax Code and the regulation 26 CFR 1.1-1 that mentions somebody's citizenship when they say who's liable, but the statute, Section 1, doesn't make any reference to anybody's citizenship. And it appears that he's been doing his homework finally, his homework assignment, and has studied my briefings and is actually curious about yet another argument, not just Section 83. Hope you enjoy the interview.
One of the things I want to cover during the course of this program. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a native of North Alabama. I have a southern drawl. I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama. I considered myself a native Huntsvillian. Huntsville's a place that has a unique spot in our nation's history, and you know what things are going on right now. It was a small county seat town back in the early 50s, and then a decision was made to bring, you know, those Nazi rocket scientists that we got from World War II. A decision was made to bring them here to North Alabama so we could start. This is what I call NASA. NASA is the North Alabama Space Agency. But in any event, one of the things we have here in Huntsville is the space program. And it's really big out here at the Arsenal, Redstone Arsenal. So that's one of the things Huntsville's known for. Huntsville is a city of about 200,000 people. We got maybe 250,000 in the whole county. You know, it doesn't take long for us to go from this cosmopolitan downtown. You know, in 15 or 20 minutes, you could be out in the middle of the country. So that's what Huntsville, Alabama is. So I hope that you will listen to this country lawyer from Huntsville, Alabama, talk to you about law. Now my background, my legal background is, I went to Cumberland School of Law. Back in when I started college, I was an undergraduate. I got an economics degree. I spent 4 years doing that, graduated with honors. And then I went, that was at Samford University in Birmingham. And then I went to Cumberland School of Law, also located at Samford University. And after I graduated, I sat for the Alabama bar exam. Within a couple of months after taking it, I got word I passed the bar. And ever since that time, I've done a whole lot of legal battles, been engaged in a lot of legal battles. But mostly since probably the mid-'80s, I have been deeply involved in what people call the tax movement. Now, what is exactly the tax movement? Well, the tax movement is, there's a segment of the American people that are really curious about why people pay income taxes. What does the Constitution say regarding the imposition of federal taxes? And after we analyze the Constitution, you know, what exactly does the laws that Congress has passed say regarding taxation? My guest this afternoon, we're going to be bringing him on after the next break. But he's a man that's really devoted a lot of time to the study of, you know, what is income. Now, I want to kind of lay, for the benefit of our audience that doesn't know much about this topic of taxation, I want to lay a foundation for our speaker this afternoon. When the United States Constitution was being discussed for drafting at the Philadelphia Convention in the summer of 1787, you know, the government, the federal government that was in place at that time was the federal government created by the Articles of Confederation, which did not have a power of taxation. Well, they wanted to improve the American Union in the summer of 1787, so the men that attended the Philadelphia Convention, they wanted to draft a completely new constitution. And during the course of the debates, it was decided, hey, we gotta have a power of taxation set forth in this United States Constitution. Well, the powers of Congress that are set forth in the United States Constitution are found in Article 1, Section 8. Now, Congress is given by means of the Constitution two powers of taxation. It can impose what are known as indirect taxes, excises, duties, and imposts. But the United States Constitution said, well, those types of taxes have got to be uniform throughout the country. Well, what are these types of taxes? Well, one is the gas tax. When you pull up to a pump, and here in Alabama, we're not like the places like Oregon. We can pump our gas here, and as you're standing there pumping your gas, you can see the taxes. Most pumps will tell you how much taxes are being paid. Well, they're going to be listing, how much federal tax is paid. Well, that federal tax on gasoline is called an excise tax, and it's required to be uniform across this country. That is one of the taxes that Congress can impose pursuant to the United States Constitution. Now, there's another type of tax, the direct taxes. And I think it's real important for me to tell you a little bit about the history of direct taxes. When the Constitutional Convention was meeting in Philadelphia and deciding to give the new federal government a power of taxation, they were sitting there, and these were men that were from the states, the new states. The states had been in existence for, about 10 years. Those states were existing, their tax revenues were derived through what is commonly known back in those days as direct taxes. Now, direct taxes are imposed upon, real property, as we're going to talk about today, income, things of that nature, things that are imposed on, major items of property. That's direct. That's the exercise of the direct taxing power. So the Philadelphia Convention said, well, we can't go in here and invade the primary source of revenue for the states. But in the event that we have some dire emergency, we want to have the federal government have the ability to invade the tax revenues of the states. States getting their revenue from direct taxes at that time, they limited the power of Uncle Sam to impose direct taxes, and they required, and we will discuss this later, they required those types of taxes to be apportioned, meaning specific amounts apportioned to the several states. That's for an introduction. That's a decent explanation of it. So with these constitutional powers in mind, the question becomes, what is the income tax? Well, there's a history behind this, a legal history behind, the whole subject of federal taxes. There's a whole subject regarding federal income taxes. But let me shortly say this. In 1892, 1893, the federal government was getting most of its revenue through import taxes. And the import taxes were quite high. And the people were feeling that bite. So if you bought some item that came from France, or if it came from, Great Britain, there was going to be an excise tax imposed on it. And they were high. And, here you had most people that are, working for a living, they were paying an excise tax because a lot of the things that they consumed were imported. Well, the big, rich and powerful, so to speak, the elite in American society at that time, they had their great wealth being protected abroad by Uncle Sam, and these people were perceived as not paying enough federal income taxes. So there was an interest back in those days in imposing a federal income tax. So in 1894, Congress did exactly that. They imposed an income tax. And here's what the statute said. They imposed the tax on citizens at home, citizens abroad, persons residing in the United States, and persons not residing in the United States for engaged or trade or business here. Those were the four human beings that were named as having their incomes taxed by this 1894 act. Well, there were some people that said, well, gee, this act is unconstitutional. And they filed a lawsuit. And that lawsuit ultimately, in the same year, 1894, went before the United States Supreme Court. And in 1894, the United States Supreme Court, in a case called Pollock against Farmers Loan and Trust, held that first income tax unconstitutional. Now remember, here you have a tax on citizens at home, citizens abroad. Those were two of the four human beings that were subject to the 1894 Act, and the Supreme Court is declaring this act to be unconstitutional because it had not been imposed by apportionment, which is required for direct taxes imposed at the federal level. Well, it took about 20 years for things to change. In 1909, the states got, well, I hear the music. We'll pick back up after this break. Law for Patriots, a program that's going to be devoted to something that at least the people on this network, there's a lot of other shows that are devoted to things other than law. Chris Ann Hall, she discusses law, but I'm sure that she discusses it from a different viewpoint from me. We have two different things we're doing here. I'm going to be primarily addressing a lot of important constitutional issues in this program. Now, let me pick back up where we were before we had that interruption for the break there. In 1909, Congress proposed the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution. It didn't say anything about amending the United States Constitution. It just simply said Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on income from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. So in 1909, Congress sends this request, so to speak, a request from Congress that the Constitution be amended by the state legislatures. Now, there's a whole book, a friend of mine, Bill Benson, back in 1984, started a project that lasted a year long. He went around to all the states that were in the Union back in 1913 to check out how the 16th Amendment was ratified. And he came up with evidence that it was not ratified, and he wrote a book called The Law That Never Was. That's an issue we've litigated in the courts, and the courts have said, well, that's a political question and we can't address. We'll probably be talking in later shows about that specific point. But nonetheless, once Philander Knox in February 1913 said the 16th Amendment, providing for a federal income tax, had been ratified by the required number of states, once he came out with that proclamation, Congress went into action. And in October of 1913, they passed the Federal Income Tax Act under the 16th Amendment. Well, to kind of come a full circle to get into what we're going to be talking about today, just like back in 1894 when the 1894 Act was challenged, there was a new challenge brought to the 1913 Act. And that's a case that went to the United States Supreme Court and decided in early 1916, a case called Brushaber against Union Pacific Railroad. And the Supreme Court said, well, gee, recounting the history, everybody knew what the history was regarding the 16th Amendment. It simply said that the types of taxes that the 16th Amendment authorized Congress to impose were in the excise tax category. Now, having said that, this is a complex topic, and if you want to know a little bit more about it, I want to direct you over to my website. Now, I have a website that I built myself. I've got another one that, the professional's been working on, but we haven't finished it yet. But if you go over to Dixieland Law Journal, just type into a search engine, don't use Google, use something like Start Page. Type in Dixieland Law Journal, and that'll carry you over to my website. Now, one of the items on the front page that I've got on my website is simply called taxation. And when you click on that taxation link, it'll carry you over to another page where I've got, a lot of items that are devoted to educating people about the income tax. So you have a lot of information there. And if you want to see a history of the income tax, as I've explained here this afternoon, click on one of those and read it. Now that I've given that background regarding the federal income tax, I want to introduce my guest this afternoon. Years ago, I ran across my guest. He was making a lot of waves. He was a guy that was, just an ordinary, everyday American who got touched by the IRS, and he didn't like getting touched by the IRS, and he didn't like what was happening to him, so he decided to hey, jump in with both feet and learn something about the income tax. And he spent decades doing this. His name is David Myrland. He's from out west. And I thought it would be great to have him on as my first guest on this program because, you know, I want to expose to our listeners this argument. You know, income, and this is what David's going to be talking about, you know, income is something that has a very specific meaning. And, you know, you can read what the Supreme Court has said about what income is, but, you know, getting down to the statutes that you find in the income tax laws, you know, that's a little bit different matter. What do they mean? And for a long time, you know, back in the 80s and 90s, a lot of people were making the argument, well, hey, income is basically, you know, if I'm working for a living, I'm swapping assets, my labor, for pay, and I don't have any income from that. So that's the basic idea of what David Myrland has been doing, and he's going to explain that to my listeners this afternoon. David, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing swell. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're coming in right, real good. For the benefit of our listeners, tell us where you're calling in from.
Okay, congratulations on your new show, and I'm honored to be your first guest on your new show, of course. I'm in Seattle.
And, you know, hey, Seattle, Washington's got some real unique features case law-wise regarding its income tax. But, you know, you've delved into the federal income tax. When did you get... I gave a little bit of an introduction for how you got into this. Can you tell our audience that from your own lips?
Yeah, and it was wonderful to hear historically from somebody that knows the history and has studied the importance of the constitutionality of income taxation and can cite those cases and obviously do it from memory. And it's not been part of my research. I really just am immersed in statutory language only, and I deal directly with the IRS. And so I don't have the occasion to study the history, and it's great to hear it from somebody that I know has devoted, you know, countless hours to research. So kudos to you, definitely.
All right. Well, hey, David, let me ask you. I've got a very specific question. What was the cause for you embarking on this journey?
Right around April 15th of 1988, as the world's fastest bartender, I got a knock on my door in the afternoon, and it was Marty Webb, IRS agent, at the door, and draped her badge across my nose, and you owe taxes because you didn't claim your tips in 1984. That was the year I filed a tax return. And I said, okay, you know, got your business card, and set up a meeting, and approaching the meeting, I rescheduled, and approaching the next meeting, rescheduled, approaching the next meeting, rescheduled, got another job, moved away, and started studying tax law. Because she said on my doorstep, you know, what kind of a memory a bartender has, right? She says, your tips are 61A gross income. Okay, I can remember that. And I went to the tax code when I finally tracked one down in a public library. I had never looked at a statute in my life. And I looked in the index, and it says requirement to report tips, section 6053. And it says if you receive tips as defined in this section, that section, this one, and it doesn't list 61A. So the first place I went, I found a lie, and I lied. I tell the truth because it's easier to remember. And so I kept studying, laid my hand on some materials, and then got into case law, a steady diet of case law. Every case you've got on the shelf there is a lesson about law from the judges once you get off the Ninth Circuit. And everything I learned from judges while I studied the structure of the tax code and its ins and outs. And in 92, I actually got hired as a full-time taxpayer advocate trying to solve these 1040 non-resident alien tax return controversies that were coming up with all the penalties and whatnot. And that's when I really had an epiphany. I went from doing tax law 2 or 3 hours a day after working for somebody else for 8 hours to doing tax law 8 to 10 hours a day. And that's when all the acquired knowledge I had sorted itself out right in front of me. I could see categories of enforcement authority in the tax code. I sorted out a bunch of things and made a couple of really original discoveries, like how to calculate cost. It's in the tax code, and the court requires that it be applied to all compensation. So nobody has a choice. And just going with that, suddenly you got a game changer as it pertains to income taxes. The word income for these purposes is equivalent of profit. Okay, income is
right.
Profit. The same word.
Yeah, hey, David, for the benefit of our listeners, this issue of what is income has made its way to the United States Supreme Court on several occasions. And basically they've said, it's a gain or profit derived from capital or labor or both combined. And, that's the concept of income. But, let me use this example, and I think this will have some bearing upon where we're going to go during the course of this program. If I bought a car this week for, let's talk about a cheap car. Let's say I bought a car for $5,000. And a week later I sold it for $5,000. Now, from an income viewpoint, you have your gross receipts, which is different from income. That's the $5,000 that I took in, that I used to pay for my car. Those two are the same. Your basis, the $5,000 that you paid for, is subtracted off from your gross receipts. So in this particular example, you have zero in the way of profit or gain. However, if I sold my car a week later for $6,000, I would strike off the basis, the $5,000 I paid for the car, leaving a profit of $1,000, and that would be the gain or profit from that transaction. Now, is that somehow related to, or can that be used to compare, when somebody sells their labor?
It's on the nose, but it has a couple of components that you don't really have to consider to get to the bottom of this concept, and the concept being, why can I not include my labor as a cost? The 40 hours that I spent this week at my employer, or the work I did at my self-employment, whatever business that is, it's gone. Those hours are gone. Why is that time spent in the labor that I put forth to create something?
All right. Well, hey, David, let me stop you right there. The music's come on, letting us know we got a break. Hey, folks. And welcome back to Law for Patriots, a brand new show here on the TogiNet Radio Network. I'm the host. My name's Larry Becraft. I'm sitting here in my office in Huntsville, Alabama, and I want to extend to you an invitation to continue listening to this radio show. And also, after the show is over with, you can tell your friends to go over to get the podcast of this program and listen to it. There's a real big problem we got here in America. The federal government is sucking off a tremendous amount of wealth from the American people. And it's obtained by chiefly taking a part of what you make by working for a living. It's a huge amount. I mean, it's got to be, for a lot of people, more than what they spend on a mortgage payment or rent during the course of a year. It's got to exceed that for most people. My guest this afternoon is David Myrland, a man who has been studying. He didn't tell us, how long he's been doing this, but he's been doing this study of, what constitutes income. And right before the break, he was getting ready to explain that to us. Now, David, the United States Supreme Court has said, in several cases, that our labor is the most fundamental form of property that we have. For most people, that's the primary property that they have, their work. And when you go out and exchange this asset that we have, our work, our labor, and exchange that for money, you know, you got some argument that what you get paid, you know, doesn't constitute all income because you got to take into consideration the labor that you put into it. Now, is that a fair summary of your argument?
Yeah, and just at the break, and this is not my argument, it is simply when you look at the law, it's the way the law reads, and so it's not really an argument, it's an interpretation of when you look at plain language. But back to a particular point before the break, why can I not write off my labor as a cost? And you can't write off labor, you have to deduct its value instead, a number value, because this is about math on a tax return, okay? So why can I not, when in fact Section 212 says every individual gets to deduct their cost? Where is cost defined in the tax code so that I know what is cost? Because anything that is cost, it's not profit. They never share a penny. Those two dynamics. I always use the analogy of a restaurateur. You know, if you own a restaurant, you're married to a restaurant. That's the maxim. And people that own restaurants work very hard for a living. So at month's end, my bookkeeper is looking at all the expenditures and all of the incoming revenue, the gross receipt. And we pay off the person that we bought all the eggs from. We pay the light bill, the lease on the building. We have payroll. We have all these expenses, a litany. There's the guy that brings us meat, the guy that brings us dairy, the guy that comes in and cleans the beer taps at night, whatever. I got all these different costs. And over in the other column, I can't put one penny yet until all of my costs are added up. Then I compare those two, and let's say I brought in $25,000. My cost was $18,000. So into the profit column, I put that extra $7,000. Where did that $7,000 come from? That came from the sweat off of my brow. How come it's been included in profit? That's what the government does right there. On the right-hand side, it's profit, pal. Nothing to see here, folks. Citizen breath, get in the turnstile, go this direction with everybody else, nothing to see here. And they don't want you getting into the tax code. There's a definition of cost. The courts and the IRS all agree. It explains how to tax your compensation for services. That's Section 83A. It's a forgotten paragraph. They won't talk about it because it says only the excess over the amount paid is gross income. And my argument is that when they say amount paid, they mean the value of any money or property that I paid for my paycheck. Well, where do you get that impression? Well, I got a regulation that defines the amount paid as the value of any money or property that I paid for my compensation. And the Supreme Court does say that labor is the most sacred and inviolable right of man. It's the foundation of all of the property and is therefore the most sacred and inviolable property. It's number one. Without labor, you don't even have a loincloth to cover yourself while you walk around smashing beetles to eat. Okay, when you think of it, labor is the foundation of everything you see that doesn't grow right out of the ground. So that particular intangible property, where is it in the law where it's not within my cost, or has it been identified as a cost and I'm just being deprived of it? And so I'm looking in the law for language that embraces that property, or maybe all property, as a cost. I found it. And for the Supreme Court, yeah, they've heard challenges before. Wages are not gross income, and the courts have all said from time immemorial, we found you wrong in this argument. And in none of those cases, and I got one question for you, you should answer this with two words. What is the most common reason for the reversal of a murder conviction?
Well, a lot of times it's the erroneous admission or exclusion of certain evidence. That's one thing. Could be bad jury instructions.
New evidence is what I was looking for.
Okay, all right.
Okay, and for any case where they say, oh, this has already been decided, wages are gross income, I have new evidence. Section 83, and it says all property is a cost. This was not in evidence in any of the cases the government cites. And I've been, as you know, I've been in court and been in court and been in court. I've got their answers. Your answers have to be the same as their answers. It's the government, and they can't talk about very key provisions in this particular equation. And while I mentioned the equation, you want to go to wevgov.com, my website, wevgov, as in we versus government, wevgov.com. And as you get into the website, there's a menu column on the left. At the top of the column, there's a link that says YouTube 2. Click on YouTube 2. I put up a YouTube video today going over the freebies I wanted to announce for the show today for your audience. Listen to the video, and right below the video in the writing, you'll have a link to download a zip file with those PDF documents in it. And the video is about those PDF documents. One part of the video is about this equation. If they start you in the profit column, you've already lost Section 83. You have to start there because the equation flows away from it. You start in Section 83 and it flows toward gross income, but only for certain property. And if you don't start there, you've lost the benefit and you're now in gross income. Section 83 governs whether or not any of your pay should be included in gross income. So you can't say gross income or profit before Section 83 has operated, and the government can't come to the podium. So
well, hey,
I have the... Go ahead.
Well, David, let me, for the benefit of our listeners, you might get a little something out of this. Let's go back a little bit into time. When the old acts, income tax acts were imposed, basically there was a set definition on, what is income, the definition, statutory definition of income. And they said it was the gains, profits, and income derived from wages, salaries, and compensation for services. Now, just that concept, that becomes Section 22 and from 1928 to all the way through the 1939 Code, Section 22, which was the statutory definition of income, said basically that the gains, profits, and income derived from wages, salaries, and compensation for services. So what you're talking about has this historical statutory foundation. But in that context, there's a rule of statutory construction, in that context, gains, profits, and income, they are different from, because they are derived from wages, salaries, and compensation for personal services. So just in that context, it looks like to me that, what you're talking about has a historical foundation. There's a difference between, the rule of statutory construction is this: each word in an act has its own separate meaning from the words surrounding it. So you have these three words: wages, salaries, and compensation for services. That's different from gains, profits, and income. And you're delving into that distinction, are you not?
It's always been one of the biggest sticking points, that derived from. That's in a lot of places. Derived from. And the way we get around that is to put together an agency of jackbooted thugs that'll walk around beating everybody up saying, we don't care what it says. The courts say that you got to pay income on your whole paycheck, income tax. And they get around it. And so but getting back to the phrase derived from, it's the difference between I have peanut butter derived from raw peanut, or I have peanut butter in the form of raw peanut. Those are two different things. You can't have one. Peanut butter in the form of raw peanut. That's how they tax you. But the law says peanut butter derived from peanut. If your labor was the peanut, what is the gain derived from the labor? That's the peanut butter. And there is no gain. And so you're right, the derived from language should be honored, but that is one of the cogs that they took, or one of the wheels they took out of the watch. It should run a different direction, and you're exactly right. Derived from, and they always skip that and just say, we've got all the case law in the world, you're wrong, and they beat you up with it and threaten you with penalties, and so you get in line with all the other sheep. That's the mechanism that they employ to get around that, but it's a fundamental tenet. It is not the labor, it is the gains derived from the labor. And they're saying gains received in the form of compensation instead.
Okay, let's go back to this illustration I was using during the course of the program, the sale of the car. If you bought it for $5,000, that's your basis. And you subtract off the basis in order to get, from your gross receipts, in order to get your gain or profit. Is what you're saying is that, you have a 100% basis in, what you're paid for working? So you get to subtract it?
I'm saying two things. I'm saying Section 83, all the courts agree, explain how to tax all compensation, and when I read it, it doesn't say the whole paycheck's gross income. Okay, so I have to stop and figure it out because everybody has to comply with the law, according to the government, and I'm going to go with it. And it says, 83A says, first off, it's called property transferred in connection with the performance of services. Sounds like a paycheck. It says only the excess.
All right,
over the amount.
Hey, Dave, I'm going to interrupt you right now because the music's come on, letting us know we got our last break. Hey, folks, we still got a few more minutes after this break. We'll close up, so stay tuned. And this is Law for Patriots. We're in our final segment here. My guest this afternoon is Dave Myrland. He's got a website. It's called We, W-E-V. Like in a lawsuit, we have that V there, it indicates versus. WeVGov, G-O-V.com. Is that it, David?
Yes, sir.
And then also for our listeners, hey, check out, Dixieland Law Journal. Type it into an internet search engine. Go over there and see it. And, I've got a lot of information on money and taxes and other constitutional issues there. It's there for your education. But David's talking about, the Section 83 of the Internal Revenue Code. Now, David, I think it's real important to, this section of the Internal Revenue Code, Section 22, back under the 1939 Code, had a whole lot of things that were included in income, a whole lot of things that were not included in income, and other items that all related to the subject of income. And it was a big old long section. So in 1954, what they did is they took that Section 22 and busted it up into a whole bunch of different sections. So we got Section 61 of the Internal Revenue Code today dealing with gross income. They got 62 and 63, to reach taxable income. But then the chapter you're talking about are the exclusions from income, which is immediately following the chapter about what is income. And all of this is from Section 22 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1939. And so there's a historical basis for what you're saying, that the old law that inserted into the current code, still says, that there's some type of exclusion for labor.
It's a matter of when it comes to the way I argue, using just current code, wherever they have their historical footing, for instance, Section 1001, 1011, 1012, and we'll get back to Section 83 immediately. Those are, what is your basis. Cost? It's also called adjusted basis, and you have to exclude it, and what remains is the realized gain. Those have their footing in Sections 1, 11, 12, and 13 in the 1939 tax code. So I'm saying the same things, but it's a catch-all. They say everything's gross income, get in line with all the other sheep. Well, income is profit. Not everything is profit, and so you have to back up and consider everything the tax code says is cost. Section 83 governs how to tax compensation, according to the courts, and so I look at its language, and it alone says only the excess over the amount paid is gross income. I don't want to violate it. I need to know what the amount paid is so I can identify the excess. I'm identifying my cost so that I know what my profit is. I'm deducting the how much I paid for the car so I know how much I benefited. Or I'm paying the guy that brings me my eggs to my diner with my meat, and I paid the waitress, and what is left after all the costs are paid is my profit. So what I'm doing is I'm defining income by using Section 83. It's the definition of income. Only the excess over the amount paid is gross income. What's the amount paid? That's my cost. and it defines the amount paid in regulation as the value of any money or property. Labor's property, I'm going to deduct its value. I got permission right here. And they can't come to the podium on this argument to say Section 83 doesn't operate like that. Well, it does, because all the case law in the world says any means all of it. And
now,
so,
David,
right.
Let me interrupt. I want to. Can you briefly? We only got a few minutes left in the program. Can you briefly talk about what you're doing in the courts for this issue?
Yeah, since it's a button they won't talk about, I'm going to push it till it falls off the control panel. If I'm not raising hell, don't bother me. I'm sleeping. And so, you give me an opportunity, I'm going to face down the government's attorneys with this argument. The exchange of briefs is complete on the 11th Circuit. The exchange of briefs is complete on the 9th Circuit. In October, a tax court case in the 7th Circuit will be complete, and he'll be going to the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. And these folks are going to the Supreme Court, and Section 83 is one of the arguments. It's never been in evidence before in any case the Supreme Court has heard regarding the average paycheck, period. So it's a first impression. And here's how the tax court allows us to calculate cost. It's statutes that they don't allow us to operate on our paycheck. They can't deny our interpretation with a contrary interpretation of certain provisions, and we want, at the very least, we want the court to declare that it's void for vagueness. The tax has to be imposed by clear language, and if they can't get into the language of these provisions, then what are we doing here? So that question is about to go to the Supreme Court and later be used as a tool to vacate criminal convictions, hopefully, by saying it even went to the Supreme Court and they can't indulge these provisions, or it's something the common man wouldn't have understood. And so we hope to get a constitutional moratorium on prosecutions under the tax code ultimately.
Hey, David, you got a very unique argument regarding Section 1 of the Internal Revenue Code. Now, that Section 1 says, it's got the chart, if you make so much taxable income, according to these charts, this is the amount that's owed. Of course, those charts are not published, but you find them in the 1040 instruction booklet. But the word individual appears there, and it doesn't say citizen. Like in the old tax acts. What's your argument in that respect?
My argument is that Congress identifies the subject of one of these income taxes by saying which citizen owes it. They identify a citizenship. They do this in the 3 Social Security chapters, which are 2, 21, and 23. And they identify a different citizen. And so I say, that's not me, and that leaves just Chapter 1. And in Chapter 1, they didn't name a subject. You got Section 1 with all the graduated income tax brackets and capital gains in Section 1H, but nowhere does it mention citizen. And in regulation alone, the Secretary of the Treasury says, who's a citizen? Oh, that's a citizen of the United States. Wherever they
subject
live,
to its jurisdiction.
You bet.
It says citizen subject to the.
It's not necessarily jurisdiction. It's statutory scope. It's how far does the statute reach. Whether or not they have the authority to reach, I'm not challenging. I'm just saying statute isn't constructed in a way that reaches me until they wrote this regulation right here that says citizens of the U.S. owe the tax. It doesn't say that in statute, and so it violates the 16th Amendment, which says only Congress can collect the tax. And you'll see all this sketched on the federal income taxation page of wevgov.com, a wonderful tutorial about this argument called Key to the Code on my YouTube page. Take the tutorials, get the materials on wevgov.com, a lot of wonderful stuff there, and a book of citizens' initiatives. If you want to define income for the purposes of state income taxes, take an initiative to the ballot that redefines the labor. You're only really restating the law as it exists today, but try to get labor moved from the profit column to the cost column, and you watch the media storm that happens from that. Even if you don't intend to take it all the way to the ballot, enter it into the list of initiatives of the Secretary of State before the signature drives begin, and man, you're going to cause a real stir with this one. It's in the book. No,
that'll wake a lot of people up.
Are you making any progress with that? I got a book of citizens' initiatives called No Confidence, Civil Liberties versus Homeland Security. It's got over 110 citizens' initiatives that I've written to cure certain problems. about a dozen proposed constitutional amendments that I'd like to see or that solve certain problems. And it's on the website, wevgov.com.
But in any event, somebody, if they're interested in this particular point, can go over your website, and you have a number of files that people can access, including videos, and they can learn the basics of this argument. Am I correct?
Oh, yes. I disclose every provision, all the case law, and books that are inexpensive. Take from Caesar, Volume 1 is the Congressional Criminal Complaint I filed with 80 members of Congress on New Year's of '06. It cost me almost $6,000 to file that with them, and it contains a briefing of these arguments, and they can't talk about these maybe 7 or 10 provisions. It's killer.
Wow. Hey, David, what do you think? What's the realistic possibilities from your viewpoint that positive change in favor of the American people will come about in reference to taxes under the Trump administration?
Who's the public servant, who's the citizen a public servant does not want to talk to? That's a public servant that knows they can arrest a felon. And when you can prove that they're committing felonies just by talking to you about income taxes, you're down the list of priorities. That's an automatic right there, because you've got the common law right of citizen's arrest. It's on the website. And if you know they're felons and you accuse them of this with my briefing, and this is not legal advice, but this is what we do to quash IRS criminal investigations, a couple of grand jury investigations, no indictment, and other people who would have been indicted, I'm certain, prevented that by going on record with these arguments to prove they have a good faith understanding of the law, which means they're not willful. And that's real progress. It comes few and far between, but when you can prevent somebody from going to prison, that's good work. And when you can do it using just the law, you're really a cut above most people out there. So it's just vitally important that people understand there are a lot of traps out there. And
hey,
the government just doesn't care.
Do you think that the American people can, there used to be a kind of a real viable tax movement here in the United States. It needs to be, it's nothing like it used to be. Do you think it can improve?
If they had a couple of real great answers to build on, I'm solution-based, and the answers that I've come up with, but what I can show you, and the government has to run from it, I can show you proof of that too. If you start with those answers, that's the way you can form a revolution right there, is that we got great reasons. You've been stealing from us for decades. Social Security obviously has never applied to Americans. If you start and stop right there, it's still grounds for major hell. And if that's where you start, you've been stealing Social Security forever. All the proof on the website, it's undeniable, irrefutable. Just take that tax, just that one. Man, you've been stealing from us for decades. It's over. And start a ball rolling. Who knows where it'll end up? But this has to be corrected. Picture what this world would be if the U.S. government hadn't stolen all that money from us over the decades. All those aircraft carriers we got parked all over the world might not be there. There might not have been the arms races that led to whatever wars. You look at all the money that was misdirected, and we got children we can't even school. No excuse. Our relationship with the federal government is utter dysfunction.
You got that right. But hey, I want to thank you for being my guest this afternoon. You're a good student of the law, and you're going to be telling us that everything that our listeners would want are on your website, right?
Yes, sir, and thank you.
And folks, be sure to come back next week. We're going to have another segment. Stay tuned. Have a great weekend.
I say good show.